idea to have this series is to reflect on the historical legacy which we have at CSDS, which is quite well known, that the engagement with the idea of democracy goes back to 1960s, when the center was established by late Professor Rajni Kothari. And there were two very interesting developments that took place in the initial years after the formation of the center. Was that one, to understand empirical nuances of Indian democracy, and second is how to interpret these nuances in a sophisticated theoretical language using concept and categories which are quite indigenous to the environment which we call India. So therefore, that led that these two engagements actually led to a series of institutional development within CSDS and outside. And we evolve as a community of researchers. So our programs like Lok Niti, Sarai, Indian Languages Program, and Parekh Institute on Indian Thought somehow contributed significantly to the idea of democracy in a broader sense. Uh, we have been thinking of reviving that tradition and to convert it into a dialogic series of inviting people to uh, reflect on this multifaceted idea of democracy. And this was basically the purpose. So we have been discussing this idea to begin with lecture series. And finally, we have now going to start this series with old friend of center, Professor Christoph Jaffrelot. Uh, when I say old friend, because institutionally as well as individually, Christoph has been associated with a number of events with CSDS and even now. So he is, we all know him and he knows center quite well. And if I say that he doesn't know any introduction, I think I'm not wrong. But because there is a convention, so I would briefly read out a few lines about him, his present engagement. Professor Christoph Jaffrelot is Director of Research at CERI SciencePo, CNRC. He is also Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute, London, non-residence fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and president of the French Political Science Association. His last book, I won't say last, I think it would be better if I say latest book, is called India's First Dictatorship, the Emergency, 1957, 1975-77, which was published by Hearst in 2020. Today, Professor Jaffrelot is going to talk about populism against democracy, or people against democracy. So, Christoph, I invite you, and floor is yours. 45 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Over
you
to you, Christoph.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hilal. And you've put me on a memory lane by reminding me of indeed my old association, my long association with CSDS, a place I visited first in the late 80s, when Rajni was, of course, still around, and Ashish and Yogen and Peter de Souza, Shell, so many friends, of course, Sanjay. I look at myself as a fellow traveler, and Anita Rampal has just sent a word in the chat, and that took me back to Bhopal when I was preparing my PhD in 87, 88. So really a lot of history behind. And this question of democracy, I'm sure, is very much the right entry point for reviving the tradition you were mentioning, Hilal. Just something about the book you've also cited. I have co-authored this book with Pratinav Anil, and I want to, of course, acknowledge that. The book will be released tomorrow. We'll have a release with Singaporean friends. It becomes more and more difficult to have interactions on sensitive, quote unquote, sensitive topics with Indian partners. So we do the book releases with Singaporean partners for the moment. Hopefully, the Indian edition will come out this month. In fact, next week supposedly, and and you will have another version of the history of the emergency based on archives that we have put online. These are the hearings of the Shah mission, of the Shah Commission, sorry, that were not easily accessible in India. We have digitized them all and made them available to the public. Anyway, today, as you said, my topic is related but different. And the question mark, the question that gives my title is Populism Against Democracy or People Against Democracy? Well, the first part of my presentation will focus on the first few words in this title. Populism is against democracy. And I'd like to explain why there are affinities between populism and authoritarianism. That will be my first section, my first part. Then I will try to show that these affinities are even more obvious in the case of national populism, that is one aspect of populism, and some kinds of authoritarianism, because we need to be more specific. Authoritarianism is too vague a term. But the third part will be about the last words of this title. Are the people against democracy? And do they support populist and even authoritarian rulers because that's their choice? And of course, these are disturbing questions, but we should not avoid them when we, as political scientists, work on contemporary politics. Well, the first part, the affinities between populism and authoritarianism, is the easiest one, because I think we clearly see why a populist political system can transition easily to an authoritarian system. I would say for three reasons. The first one is the personalization of power that populism implies. Now, that's a major feature of populism. The heroification of the leader, what Ambedkar would have called personality cult, the way leaders can be worshipped and therefore sit or be situated beyond accountability. Well, this reading of populism in terms of personalization of power is something that has been very well theorized by Pierre Ostigui. And by the way, I suppose you have understood that you will have to read in between the lines today, and I will focus on theories and theoreticians on purpose. Of course, they are very useful, but they would have been there only as footnotes if I could have taken India as a case study. In fact, India will be in the footnotes and in between the lines, but I'm sure you know the situation well enough, and therefore you will be able to connect the dots. Yeah, the theoretician of populism who has the most aptly demonstrated the specificity of the special relationship the populist forms with his people is Pierre Ostigui, to my mind. Because Ostigi shows that populism, this relationship of the populists with these people, has two sides of the same coin, in fact. One is based on resentment of the people. He is seen as the man who defends the plebs, the plebeians, against the establishment, against the elite groups. He is preparing the revenge of those on the bottom. And therefore, he shares their culture, or at least he shares their manners and their language by opposition to the elite's propriety. So transgressing codes of good behavior in the name of authenticity, because the elites have betrayed this authenticity because of their cosmopolitanism, because of their all corruption that can be moral, that can be financial. In contrast, is speaking like the people, like the victims. And by the way, victimization is very much a feature of the populist leader. The populist leader is constantly saying, look, I'm under attack. I'm under attack because of the media, because of the liberals, because of the intellectuals. I'm with you. You are victims also. We are all victims. So that's one side of the way the populist leader relates to his people, quote unquote. But there is another side that is equally important. The populist leader is like us, but he is much better than us. He is a hero. He is a strong man. He is a man who does things nobody dared to do before. And on the Indian side, the list could be very long of all these things strong men in the history of India have achieved. And therefore, right or wrong, by the way, they are exceptional. They may be exceptionally wrong, but still exceptional. They are doing things that were unprecedented vis-a-vis Pakistan, vis-a-vis all kinds of topics. Well, that fits in the definition of charisma by Max Weber. Max Weber does not consider that the charismatic leader is necessarily doing good things. He's doing exceptional things. He's an exceptional man or woman. He says, Max Weber, certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. They are not accessible to the ordinary person, but regarded as of divine origin or as exemplary. Very interesting. In this definition, nowhere you see virtue as a criterion for charisma. The main criteria is exceptional. So the populist is like us and the ego ideal, the man you identify with and that you, in fact, venerate, worship, that is the word. Well, inevitably, when a populist defined that way wins election, he concentrates power in his hand the day after, because he is the one who has the legitimacy. And even his party people have won because of him only. So institutions, including parties, lose their relevance, their importance, and power is inevitably concentrated in the end of one man only, the populist leader. That's one affinity between populism and authoritarianism. The second one is developing in relation to his opponents. if the populist can claim that he embodies the whole nation, that is coextensive with the nation, because he is the people. This is, by the way, the title of a book by Parto Chatterjee recently. I am the people. If I am the people, what space is left for the opponents? None. The opponents are necessarily illegitimate, anti-national, traitors. They lose their relevance because of the unanimity that the populist leader is supposed to embody. And of course, there are good reasons for delegitimizing the opponents. No, they are part of the establishment of yesterday. They are corrupt for that very reason. That is particularly damaging for parliamentary democracy, because when you do not respect those who sit in parliament in the ranks of the opposition, you destroy parliament as a place for debates, as a place for deliberation. And it's one of the things Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt show very well in the case of the US. In a book, I'm sure you know, How Democracies Die, they show that this delegitimization of the opposition is badly damaging for parliamentary democracies. And they say politicians are more likely to be forbearing when they accept one another as legitimate rivals, and politicians who do not view their rivals as subversive will be less tempted to resort to norm breaking to keep them out of power. That's the problem. The absence of legitimacy of the opponent transforms the adversary into an enemy. And therefore, there's no way you can work together in any assembly for preparing bills and laws. And of course, the opponents are not only the political adversaries transformed into enemies, but of course also NGOs, trade unions, universities, all places where diversity debates are, of course, legitimate. Because again, if the leader is the nation, how can you criticize the way is representing the nation and acting in the name of the nation? So that's the second reason why you can see affinities between populism and authoritarianism. The third reason why we see affinities between the two has to do with the disinstitutionalization of the state. I have mentioned the way parties could lose their relevance, and therefore a very important institution of any democracy, political party, is in danger. But beyond the parties, other institutions, state institutions, are inevitably affected by this idea that the populist leader gets all the legitimacy. In fact, that's something Edward Shields, one of the fathers of the British sociology and American sociology in the 50s, had already highlighted. He said the populist is placing the will of the people above everything. Populism, I quote, identifies the will of the people with justice and morality. So if the spokesperson of the people, of the people's morality and sense of justice says something, how can the court object? The court is only contradicting the only legitimate, you can say even sacred um, line, that is the people's voice. By the way, people's voice was something Donald Trump used a lot. I am your voice. He kept saying, I am your voice. So I am your voice against the institutions which are contradicting, obstructing the implementation of policies dictated by the people's voice. What will that translate into? It will translate into a reform of the way judges are appointed, because they cannot be appointed by anybody but the person who speaks in the name of the people. And they have to be, of course, respectful of the will of the people, these judges. So independence of the judiciary usually is a collateral casualty of populism. Well, not only that, but the bureaucrats. How can the bureaucrats do anything but what the people want? And the politicization of the state bureaucracy is usually something you will see very soon after populist leaders have taken over. We saw that in Hungary when Orban not only changed the way judges were appointed, but also the way bureaucrats were transferred. And among the state's agents, civil servants, policemen, of course, are among those who have to fall in line the most quickly, the most significantly. Very often they have to join hands with the private army or the vigilante groups that the populist has created for doing the dirty job, the dirty work at the grassroots level. And again, Levitsky and Ziblatt say something very interesting, because they consider as one of their indicators of authoritarian behavior the fact that rulers, I quote, endorse violence by their supporters by refusing to unambiguously condemn it and punish it. And therefore the police is not supposed to take care of the private armies of the populist, but on the contrary, protect them. So these are the three main reasons why we can definitely see affinities between populism and authoritarianism. Personalization of power translating into concentration of power once elections are won. The disinstitutionalization of the state, and also the legitimization of the opponents. Now, these are very broad categories. And in this second part of my talk, I'd like to be more specific, because these two isms, populism and authoritarianisms, need to be disaggregated. There are variants of populism. There are variants of authoritarianism. So let's try to be more specific and see what are the variants of both, which are even more conducive one to the other. Well, the variant of populism I'd like to focus upon is what Gino Germani called national populism. That's a good word that helps us to differentiate populism of the left from populism of the right. And that's a distinction that is very meaningful. In fact, we tend to forget that populism was born on the left, at least in the 20th century. The most effective populist leaders in Latin America in the first place, because that's where this ism has flourished the most, the earliest also. In that part of the world, the supporters of populism were of the left. And Perón, for instance, in Argentina, who was probably the first populist to be re-elected and to influence politics over so many decades, was of the left. Well, it's important to factor that in, because My definition of populism is not based on ideology. I don't follow Cass Muder, who says populism is an ideology. I think it's a style of politics. But it's a style of politics that will adopt some ideological components. And sometimes they will borrow from leftist agendas like Peron, or they will borrow some of their sources of inspiration from rightist ideologies. And this is what I would like to focus upon, because national populism is much more important than populism of the left today. Populism of the left is very much on the wane in Greece, in Spain, in Italy. You still have populist parties of the left and populist leaders of the left, but they are much less influential than the political parties drawing their inspiration from rightist ideologies. So this is why we need to focus on national populism. And national populism is a doctrine that borrows its ideological premises from rightist views of the world, in the sense that the leader does not claim to represent the entire population, but only the majority community. He is the defender of the sons of the soil. And this group can be defined along racial lines, the white supremacists, religious lines, Hindu nationalists, linguistic lines, and so on and so forth. But it shows that you have a majoritarian agenda, and the national populist defends the majority defined according to these ascriptive criteria against others. Again, against the establishment, but against the establishment for another reason, because the establishment protected enemies of the nation. And they can be anything. They can be a religious minority, they can be the migrants coming from abroad, they can be the adversary enemy next door, they can be the European Union, because they dictate our policies, agendas, but they are the champions of a nation that is defined ethnically and that is not coextensive with the whole of society. Well, what does that mean? It means that in a democracy that becomes majoritarian, you transform the regime into what is known as an ethnic democracy. The national populist will transform the political system, transitioning from liberal democracy to ethnic democracy. Because if the people that matters is only made of the sons of the soil, then you do not have to give the same rights to everybody. You're still in a democracy. And I'll return to this very important question. The legitimacy of the populist comes from electoral results. So he needs elections. He needs democracy. Otherwise, he loses his legitimacy. But this democracy needs to be qualified. And one of the qualifications is the ethnicization of democracy. Well, the model for this, and in fact, the very notion of ethnic democracy comes from this model, is Israel. And ethnic democracy is a formula that has been coined by an Israeli political scientist, Sami Smoha, who says that in a country like that one, the ideology of the Jewish majority is based on protection of the majority's interest and rejection of the other perceived as a threat to the survival and integrity of the ethnic nation. So Israel is the prototype, is the archetype of an ethnic democracy, because you end up by ethnicizing the state. The system, political system, is inspired from the parliamentary system of the West. So you have a parliament, you have a Supreme Court, you have free press, you have many ingredients that you find in a democracy, in a proper democracy. But some citizens are more equal than others. There is a majority that is de facto and sometimes de jure the only legitimate body in the political system. And therefore we have seen the Judaization of identity symbols. Smua says Israel's titular name, calendar, days and sites of commemorations, heroes, flag, emblem, national anthem, names of places, you can say names of roads, ceremonies and the like are all Jewish. So in an ethnic democracy, you do vote, but the majority rules. And the political democracy, the ethnic majority and the political majority coincide. So that's why I would say that we have here a clear form of authoritarianism. Because the very idea of ethnic democracy is a contradiction. It's a way to salvage the word democracy. It's like in the formula illiberal democracy. Orban doesn't want to be seen as authoritarian. So he say, I am for illiberal democracy. Yes, but illiberal democracy is authoritarianism. And similarly, ethnic democracy is a form of authoritarianism. When you do not give equal rights to all the citizens, you're in a non-democratic system. So the national populist leader is taking his country to an ethnic democracy system that is a form of authoritarianism. But it's not only democracy that can be somewhat disaggregated. It's also authoritarianism. And I would say populism, national populism in particular, has affinities with two kinds of authoritarianism. We need to disaggregate this idea. And I will follow, again, theoreticians which have helped us to disaggregate this notion. The first one is the theory of electoral authoritarianism, a notion that has been introduced by Andreas Chedler, that says that, yes, we have elections. And I repeat, populists need elections, otherwise they lose their only source for legitimacy. But these elections are distorted. And this distortion come from different sources. He say the authoritarian regimes, Schedler says, distort the formation of popular preference as well as the expression of popular preferences by interfering with elections in charge of organizing elections, election commission, for instance, by making competition unequal in terms of money, and of course electoral bonds are a case in point, and by restricting freedom of expression, including media independence. Well, you very clearly imagine how that can find expression in concrete terms. To make an election commission less effective, you transfer bureaucrats. To make the media less independent, you ask the media owners to replace critical journalists by more docile ones, and these owners may very well obey simply because they need the state support for their own business. And of course, you can harass the journalists directly, not only by trolling them, but also by intimidating them via the income tax department's activities. That's something, by the way, we show in the case of the emergency, where the IT department was very much used. But that has been emulated more recently. And of course, you can file against journalists cases in the name of defamation or sedition, and the judiciary may help the populist leader because they have been appointed by the rulers themselves, or because they've been blackmailed as well. Well, what does that mean? It means that you have election, but you do not have real competition. By the way, electoral authoritarianism can also be called competitive authoritarianism. There is some competition, but there is no way the opposition can win. And it's for all the reasons I have mentioned, plus, of course, naturally, the delegitimization that I have mentioned already in the name of anti-national activities. That's one variant of authoritarianism that has specific affinities with populism, electoral authoritarianism. I repeat, populists need elections. So they have to find a way to organize elections that they cannot lose. But there is another variant of authoritarianism that is very interesting, and that is called by Juan Linz neo-sultanism. Well, again, we are back to Max Weber, who is so heuristic always. Max Weber had primarily worked on sultanism, and he had considered that sultanism was a political regime that was defined primarily with arbitrariness. In Economy and Society, he has this definition. He says, a political domination, where political domination operates primarily on the basis of discretion, it will be called sultanism. So Juan Linz, one of the best analysts of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, and as you know, Juan Linz co-authored a book with Al Stepan and Yogendra Yadav, so the connection with CSDS is direct. Juan Linz elaborated upon this Weberian notion, saying sultanism or neo-sultanism is a form of personal rulership based on a mixture of fear and rewards. And he emphasized the patrimonial dimensions of sultanism, saying among the ruler's collaborators are members of his family, friends, cronies, business associates, and men directly involved in the use of violence to sustain the regime. So here we have another dimension. The populist does not only speak for the ethnic majority, does not only contest elections with a very uneven level playing field, but has also built an entourage made of, I repeat, family members, friends, cronies, business associates, and men directly involved in the use of violence to sustain the regime. That's very important. First of all, you have this patrimonial dimension. You know, the authoritarian ruler, I quote Linz again, demands gifts and payoffs from business for which no public accounting is given. They establish profit-oriented monopolies, and the economy, be it public or private, is subject to considerable governmental interference, but not for the purpose of planning, but for extracting resources. Now, that's something we see in many, many, many places today. The authoritarian leader, as his cronies, as his oligarchs, is not market-oriented, is not market-friendly, is building a clique of rich supporters. Probably the first one to have invented this modus operandum is Putin, because Putin used oligarchs, as you know. But you may not need to go that far. You may have this give and take kind of bargaining situation. You give licenses, protection to crony capitalists, and in returns, they will pay for your expenditures because you have to win elections, I repeat, and elections are very costly. So you need money for that. So that's the patrimonial dimension. We have a kind of privately owned economy, but owned by very few people. Oligarchs at the helm of oligopolistic companies, turning into monopolies sometimes at some point. And the other side of this definition by Linz is, of course, this idea that we need private armies when we are in this situation as a sultan. No, the private armies, the vigilantes, who will be used for targeted killings, for poisoning. It's much better to have people who pay allegiance to the man directly for these things, rather than state agents. So parallel to the state, you have a kind of parallel structure that is used for coercion. So to conclude this second part, I would say that national populism is the subcategory of populism that has the clearest affinities with authoritarianism, but not with any kind of authoritarianism, with a form of authoritarianism that combines three dimensions: ethnic democracy, that makes the ethnic majority coextensive with the political majority, the electoral authoritarianism, because elections are needed, and thirdly, neo-sultanism, the way Linz has defined it in terms of discretion, personal power, crony capitalism, or at least oligarchies, and privatization of violence with the use of private armies. That's where many countries in the world are today. The list would be very long. You know, countries fulfilling these criteria are in large numbers. Now, my last part will try to respond to the question I asked in the introduction. What do people think about it? Because you may vote for a populist and authoritarian once because you believe in his promises. Many of them are demagogues, of course. But how can you explain re-election of populist turned authoritarian leaders? And that's why I had this somewhat provocative subtitle, is populism against democracy or are people against democracy? And here I will try to just give you some idea of why the question is not so irrelevant. No, there are at least two reasons why it makes sense. First of all, what I call this the strongman syndrome, that shows that in many countries, security is more important than liberty. And secondly, we'll turn to the majoritarian question in a different perspective. Well, I will use surveys, so I'm sorry, I will give some figures now to document this argument, to support this argument. Well, my argument is that in some countries, authoritarian populists are elected because that's what the voters want. The Pew Research surveys that are usually done in 34 countries every year show that the proportion of those who were dissatisfied with the way democracy worked in 2019 was very high. 52% as an average considered that democracy did not work well. And these percentages were much higher in countries like the US, 59%, Spain, 68%, Italy, 68%. People were not happy with the way the democracy functioned, and that's probably why they voted for populists as well. In fact, we have another question that shows that populists got it right when they mobilized voters against establishment people. 70% of the people in UK said elected officials do not care what people like me think. 68% in Italy, 76% in Spain, 71% in the US, 76% in France. Those who have been elected in the name of democracy do not care for me, they care for them. So the rejection of democracy is unprecedented. In fact, we have reached a level of distrust for democracy that is unprecedented in the post-World War II democratic world. Incidentally, that's a parenthesis, but incidentally, these surveys also show that there is one thing people are very attached to: the right to vote. They don't believe in democracy, but they believe in vote. They don't believe in the system, but they still think that voting makes some difference. So they want to continue to be in a position to vote. And this is why also the populists turned authoritarian do not want election to go. Even Putin organizes elections every 5 years. Even if there is only one candidate, you need to get the legitimacy of the vote, and people are very attached to the vote. So if they are not happy with the way democracy works, what do they want? Here you see a very interesting tension between a general attachment to democracy and a demand for authority and security. They are responding to the demand for security. Sorry, they are demanding more security, and that's why they turn to strongmen. When you look at the way they valorize security at the expense of liberty, you find the usual contradictions. And that's something, a very interesting article by Do Chul Singh and Anna June Kim showed. Many people considering themselves to be avid supporters of democracy show support for authoritarian rule because behind democracy, they put notions like security. So you vote for security, you think you vote for democracy. So you proclaim you are a staunch Democrat, but in fact, you're for a kind of democracy that promotes security at the expense of liberty and equality. And that's what the 2017 Pew Research survey showed. They showed that pro-democracy attitudes coexist with openness to non-democratic forms of governance, including rule by experts, a strong leader, or the military. Now, the 2017 Pew survey is particularly interesting in that sense. They realize, they show that you have only 23% of the interviewees who are committed Democrats. 47% are less committed Democrats because they are willing to have the country ruled by experts, strong leaders, or military. And the popularity of experts' rulings or rule by the experts is really very large. You don't want members of parliament, you don't want government responsible before assemblies who want experts to rule the country. This is something you do find particularly clearly in the case of few countries, including South Korea. 52% would prefer to be governed by experts. Poland, 50%. But the strongman supporters are also in large proportions in many old democracies. 31% in Japan would prefer a strongman at the helm, 29% in Italy, 26% in UK, 25% in Israel, 24% in Hungary, and they have it, and they got it. So that's the clear contradiction that one can see between attachment to democracy and a definition of democracy that is completely different. Let me give you the figures for India, because I find them even more revealing. There, again, you see the demand for a strong leader that is clearly related to an acute feeling of vulnerability, resulting in a quest for security. According to the Pew survey, while crime takes the top spot on the list of the problems citizens are facing, Indians look at terrorism in particular as the main threat. 76% of the respondents consider that terrorism is the most important issue they are facing in the 2017 Pew survey. And by the way, this is well in tune with the idea that ISIS appear to be the main threat over India. 66% of the respondents, in spite of the fact that ISIS had never led any strike in India. And the need for a strong leader results from this. In fact, you have many questions documenting this to such an extent that the Pew team said that support for autocratic rule is higher in India than in any other nation surveyed, 34 nations. It's one of the only 4 nations where half or more of the public supports governing by the military. And an even larger proportion, 2/3, say A good way to govern the country would be experts, not elected officials, making decisions according to what they think is best for the nation. And of course, supporters of the BJP were overrepresented in these three groups. So you have 55% of the respondents in India who are backing the idea that a governing system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference from parliament of the court would be a good system. That's why you see clear correlation between the way populism / authoritarianism could probably find some constituency. So that's one way to explain why populist turned authoritarian leaders can be re-elected. But there is another explanation, and that's the last point I would like to make. But in the case of majoritarian democracies, the majorities, ethnic majorities, are not directly affected by the illiberal character of an ethnic democracy. The democracy being the rule of the majority, the ethnic majority that prevails is fine because it rules. And therefore, in many ethnic democracies, when you do surveys, you realize that people find their democracy absolutely perfect. They have no problem with the way the majority rules because they are the majority. And a majority of the respondents are from that majority. So this is the demotic side of democracy that asserts itself at the expense of the liberal side of democracy, rule of law, equality of citizens. But if we go by numbers, at the end of the day, that's what democracy is about. Everything is fine. That's exactly what we saw as early as the 90s in Israel. You know, Smua says Jewish public opinion not only condemns constraints imposed on Arabs, but also endorses preferential treatments for Jews. An opinion poll taken in 1995 among Israeli Jews showed that 74.1% of them expected the state to give Jews preferential treatment over Arabs. Who, for 30.9% of the respondents, should not even have the right to vote. 30.9% of the Jewish respondents in these 1995 surveys said not only Jews should have a preferential treatment, but Arabs should not even have the right to vote. So when you have these premises, it makes a lot of sense for the majority to find the system working well. My last quote would be, most Jews do not even perceive the differential practices as discriminatory against Arabs, but consider rather as preferences rightfully accorded to them as Jews in a Jewish state. And that's the last word I would like to utter because I've been too long. Well, clearly the next step when you are in an ethnic democracy is to transform it into an ethnic state and jump from de facto majoritarianism to de jure majoritarianism. And that's why laws matters. Amendments to the constitution matters. And that's the step that some countries have not gone into yet. But the logic would be that you transform gradually ethnic majority into authoritarian regimes and finally forms of apartheid. Because the logical conclusion of this way of looking at quote unquote citizenship it takes you to this direction. Anyway, I've been too long indeed, and I don't want to recap. I hope my demonstration, quote unquote, was clear enough, and I want more time for the discussion. Thank you, Hilal.